It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Osvaldo Novais Oliveira, best known as Professor Shu. Everybody knows him as Professor Shu. He is a highly ranked physicist in this country. He has held many honorary positions, administrative positions, and scientific positions in funding agencies. He is currently the coordinator, one of the coordinators of the physics session of FAPESP. And as you know, a large fraction of the school was funded by FAPESP. But before I pass the word to Professor Shu, he works on material science and physics, applied physics. He also works on natural language processing, and he is a real expert on writing scientific papers. He is the author of this book, and he was kind enough to give us 5 of these books. So we have to find a way to give you 5 of these books. So in the end, let's do some brainstorming here and to decide how I'm going to distribute these 5 books. But I have some ideas there, and I have my own copy. You know, one is saved for me. And anyway, Professor Osvaldo is highly cited. He is extremely efficient, and he is also the coordinator, one of the coordinators of physics at FAPESP. So he kindly agreed to give a short talk about the main focus of FAPESP, especially regarding young international students and visiting professors. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Edgar, for the kind introduction. I here represent Professor Brito Cruz, who is the scientific director. He could not come, so he sent his warmest regards to all of you, and welcome to the students and professors who came from other countries as well. And obviously, I should congratulate Edgar and his big team for putting this school together. It's going to be very short. It's only 17 slides. But I'll give some context, some background for our distinguished guests from other countries. So the first thing I should mention is that Brazilian science is very young. So you can see the dates here of foundation of important institutions in the country, funding agencies, universities. But perhaps the best example is an interesting story that in the early 20s, Albert Einstein came to Brazil for many reasons, including to commemorate his, the observation that confirmed the general theory of relativity, which was made in Brazil. And he was welcomed, being such an important guest, he was welcomed by the Brazilian community of physicists, mathematicians, chemists. And all of them could be fitted in a room, just a living room. So all the scientists in the early 20s in our country could be fit in a room. Scientists in physical sciences. But you see, we have some dates there. FAPESP in particular was founded in '62, so it's barely 50 years old. Some other national institutions were founded in the early 20s, and the universities, the USP, our university, was founded in 1934, so it's less than 100 years old. We had some higher education institutions in the 19th century, but they were not fully fledged universities. But we made tremendous progress over the last few years, so we now have a relatively strong academic base, so you see the number of PhDs every year in the country is considerable. The number of publications as well. There are some challenges because we have reached, say, a high productivity, but the impact is still not the impact that we think that the country should reach, so that's a big challenge there. The other important challenge is related to innovation. As if you see, for instance, our contribution to patents in the world is really very small. It's a point-something%, while our contribution in the number of scientific papers is close to 2%. So it's actually, we need to invest in innovation, and actually the CEPID that is, that's led by Professor Gazzanotto is doing a great job on that as well. So there are several challenges that I put, that Professor Brito listed there. São Paulo State has a distinct funding policy because most of the money for research and higher education is fixed by law, which means that we have autonomy and flexibility on how we can spend the money. So close to 10%, or a little bit less than 10% of the VAT is really equivalent to the VAT in Great Britain, for instance, go to the state universities, and FAPESP gets 1%. And this has been on, there's been, all the governors have abide by this law, and therefore we get the money every year. And I'm going to show some numbers later on. So one of the effects of having this stable funding is that the country has 25% of the scientists, but we create 44% of the output in terms of articles and also in terms of the PhD theses that are concluded every year. This is better shown in this map. You see, the state of São Paulo here, it's much, it's a small part of the country. It's close, we have around 20% of the population, but 32% of the GDP, the gross domestic product, and 45%, close to 45% of the Brazilian science. In the state, we have 3 state universities, 3 federal universities, plus another higher education institution, so that 3 federal universities includes, obviously, Federal University of São Carlos here, and with another campus in Sorocaba. So what distinguishes FAPESP from other agencies throughout the world is that in addition to this utilitarian view that's adopted by most countries and agencies today, through which there is the hope to use science or invest in science so that we can have a direct return to society in terms of improving health, making more money, and so on. There is also this not utilitarian view in which we invest a lot of money just to discover things in all areas, regardless of whether this is going to have a direct application to society. So this is interesting because it makes us a little bit comfortable for those who want to do basic research. So obviously the creation of FAPESP has inspired other states to create their own institutions, so their own agencies, which are very similar to FAPESP in the way they function. Unfortunately, not a single one of them has this stable funding that FAPESP has, which is a pity. But nevertheless, these state agencies are now contributing to close to 25–30% of the funding in the country. So the mission of FAPESP is to support research in all fields. So as I mentioned, not only those fields which can bring return to the investment directly to society, and then another feature of FAPESP, which is very interesting, is that average time for decision is very small, probably one of the smallest in the world, only for most projects, close to 2 months that people can have the results of their applications. So that's really interesting. Then the success rate is also very high, bound to decrease a little bit because we have a bigger community, a growing community, and not more money. The annual budget last year was around $510 million. So these are the numbers of fellowships for undergrad students, masters, PhD students, and so on. And then I'll talk about some of the other projects as well, which include money for small companies and collaboration between industry and academia. So another consequence of this, say, stable investment over the years is that our science grew a lot, and you can see here the number of papers published per year in São Paulo state is already higher than any other country in America. If São Paulo were to be a country, just separating São Paulo from the other states of our country, you see São Paulo alone is bigger in terms of science than any Latin American country. So there are many papers and cover pages of journals from science produced in our state. And now I'll go to the main programs. First of all, I should, especially for our international guests, I should mention that there is a peculiarity in our system in that the scholarships at all levels, so from for undergraduate students to postdocs, you can apply to these scholarships separate from a research grant. So it may occur that a scientist may just not, if it's a theoretician, for instance, he may not have a research grant approved, but he or she can still apply for a scholarship for a student. So the scholarships don't come together with the research grants. So this gives some additional flexibility in the system. So it is different from other countries like most countries in Europe or in the US, in which scholarships are always tied to a research grant. And then there are scholarships of all levels, as you can see here. And in terms of research grants, the most important ones are the CEPIDs, which includes 11-year funding, so up to 11 years of funding. And these should be interdisciplinary research centers. So one of the research centers led by Professor Edgar Zanotto. And then there are Young Investigator Awards. I'll talk about this in a moment, a little bit more. Thematic research projects, which are, say, big projects with funding up to 5 years, and ordinary research grants for 2-year funding. There are special programs in FAPESP as well. These are thematic programs which usually include several different projects up and down the state. And these are thematic, and the main themes are here. You see biodiversity, bioenergy research, neurosciences, and so on and so forth. And then there is this application-oriented research, which helps small businesses to develop innovation and help academia or research institutions to collaborate with industry. So these are the two programs, the small business one and the other one, which is joint university and industry. A recent program which is really interesting is in a case in which we have all the ingredients of a research and innovation project. And this has been launched a few years ago and has the contribution from FAPESP and a partnership between an industry or several industries and university. And so the PI is a professor from a university, and typically FAPESP gives one, the industry gives one, and the university gives two. Obviously the ratio, the proportion that is given by the university is higher because you include the salaries. So all the infrastructure that the university provide for the project. So it's up to 10-year contract, and typically 2 to 6 million reais per year from FAPESP and from the company. And obviously, there are the labor costs by the university. So there are, one center has been selected, and 5 others are under, say, review. And these are the names of the companies. So usually there are big companies which are interested in developing research and innovation in a particular area of its interest. And therefore you have a consortium of universities collaborating with the industry to develop these programs. So FAPESP helps with financial support. So now international collaboration, this, you cannot see much there, but just to show that we have many, over 100, 200 agreements with agencies, universities, and universities in several different countries, mostly in Europe and in North America. And so now talking about FAPESP international collaboration, there are several opportunities. For instance, the postdoctoral fellowships, which is open for Brazilians and non-Brazilians as well. I'll talk specifically about this later on. The Young Investigator Award, I would also talk about this in a moment. Visiting scientists, so scientists which are well established in other countries can come to São Paulo for a given period of time, from some weeks to 1 year, and FAPESP will fund the whole stay. There are the São Paulo Schools of Advanced Sciences, as this one, and another thing which is rather new, it's only a few years old, this São Paulo Excellence Chairs. These are projects devoted to bring, to make it possible for highly recognized scientists from other countries to establish a research project with partners in our country. And this sort of important scientist does not need to come and live here. He can come up to 12 weeks per year, so close to 3 months each year, stay here in different periods of time, collaborating with these groups. It's like a person who has a center of research in the country, in the state, and the person does not need to be a professor in one of our institutions. So he can keep his job wherever he gets his job, his or her job, and collaborate with his team here in our state. So now for the postdoctoral fellowships, so as I mentioned, can be Brazilian or foreigner. There is a stipend which is quite good. It's quite a good amount of money. So there is also money for moving, for those who come from other countries, and installation, including for the family. And then there is also this 50% for research incidentals, so that the postdoc can have money to attend conferences or buy small piece of equipment or consumables or whatever he or she finds it suitable. And then, so they can find opportunities here, or you can just contact a supervisor and get a program. The Young Investigator Award is a little bit different because the person is entitled to have not only his scholarship, the money for his stipend, his or her stipend, but also money for a fully fledged project. So consumables, equipment, so on and so forth, in any institution in the state. So this is quite an interesting program. It can be for non-Brazilians as well. So you see typical values range from $200,000 up to $2 million for a given project, which include the stipend, scholarships for the students included in the program, in the project, plus money for equipment and consumables. And the success rate is not as high as in other programs, so it's a little bit lower because it's a quite generous program, and there are a lot of money, so it's a little bit more difficult than getting a PhD, postdoc fellowship. And if you want to learn more about research, there is this FAPESP newsletter in English, and you can go and if you Google it, and you find, and you can follow what's going on in our state, and have specific information for all of those programs that I mentioned. I want to make it as short as possible because I will be quite happy to take questions, including in Portuguese, for if there are shy Brazilian students, if you want If they want to ask in Portuguese, I'll translate and answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for this very clear introduction to FAPESP's programs. Questions? Is there any question? Well, I have one to start. Could you just dwell a little bit more on this Young Investigators Award? I mean, is it a guy who has never been here, he did his postdoc somewhere else and wants to move here, he can apply?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Straight away to this?
Yeah, straight away, yeah. The Young Investigator Award, or this investigator can be from any part of the world. He or she does not need to have any connection in Brazil. The only thing that he or she needs is an excellent proposal in terms of bringing something new to our country, to our state, so something that people are not doing. And then he or she chooses an institution that can host him or her. And that's the only requirement. Typically, we expect this person to be young, but have some experience with postdocs. So the person should have, say, 2, 3, 4 years of postdoc. So not just someone who has just finished a PhD. So that we can more or less be sure that this person is capable of running a project on his or her own, independently. So the Young Investigator Award is for independent researchers. He or she will not have a supervisor. So the person must be capable of doing research on his or her own. And so that's the only limitation. So, you know, we are really looking forward to bright young investigators to bring to our state.
Just to complement, and how is this person inserted in our centers? Does FAPESP have an agreement with the institutes, or in terms of infrastructure, how do you insert this person?
The person needs to have the agreement of the institution, the host institution, stating that the institution will provide the infrastructure for developing the project. Space, infrastructure in terms of electricity, computational power, libraries, whatever. So more or less the same as we do with our ordinary projects. So the institution must say, we can accept, host this young investigator, and we'll provide him or her with the infrastructure that's needed. In São Paulo State, always in São Paulo State, yeah.
Okay, in former times, FAPESP also had wanted that this young award would be in centros
emergentes.
Yeah. Is that still?
No, that's no longer the case. Now the young investigator can apply to any place. The only requirement is that the person needs to do something which is really new, that does not exist in the place. Not just, if you come to a strong group and do sort of marginal things in that big group. So that's the requirement.
This is the case also for Brazilian.
Also for Brazilians.
That needs to be emergent.
That's right, yeah. And for the Brazilians in particular, there is another requirement which is very important, that the young investigator will only be able to get his grant approved, his or her grant approved, if he or she has international experience. So if the person did his or her whole career in our country without reasonable international experience, he or she will not be eligible.
It's known that it became really, really difficult to get fellowships in recent years.
Yeah.
Like I had 2 proposals turned down for the first time in 30 years, and that was because my student had a C like 5 years ago in the first semester of his master's course. So how does that FAPESP analyze the CV of foreign students that sometimes they do not even take classes, in some countries?
It's always, first of all, for the Brazilians who are applying or have applied in the recent past, what happened is a very simple thing. Our community is growing, still growing, more or less like that. And the money available, as you know, comes from the taxes, is more or less like this. Dropping a little, not much, but dropping. And the community is increasing. So we have crossed the point where all the good projects now require more money than we have available, which means competition is much tougher. And we have to sort of look at these sort of scores of even undergrad degrees as well. For the foreign, it's always very hard for us to compare. And we do require their transcripts of scores, but in some cases in Britain there are no courses, no disciplines, and therefore we have to rely on their publications. And obviously a way to compensate this is that unless the person is really good, we are not going to spend that much amount of money to bring the person to the country. So that's a sort of compensation. So to award, to give a scholarship for someone who comes from another country, we must be sure that the person is really good. If it's more or less the same average of the good Brazilians, so there's not a big point, no point in bringing them. So it's a way to compensate.
Yeah, having moved to Brazil 4 years ago, I can really only attest that the quality of the graduate students here at USP is extremely high, and so grades of a B is still a good grade, and if it should not be used as a rejection criterion by FAPESP. An A at IFSC is worth much more than an A at the University of Mato Grosso. Yeah. And so, since you're saying, as you cannot judge the quality and the scholastic records of the foreign applicants, wouldn't it be better to simply compare the publications and the productivity of the Brazilians versus the foreigners?
Yeah. This, I mean, we have to do many things. For instance, comparing publications, we have to see whether the person is in a group with many collaborators, or how strong the group is. So the same applies here. And so the comparison is very tough. And sooner or later, we have to use subjective criteria because we cannot just apply objective criteria in those cases. This was not a big problem when the amount of money was sufficient for the very good students to get their scholarships. But now that that's no longer the case. So we are sort of trying to find ways to cater for that. We do know that in some institutions getting an A or a B, or the scores vary from one institution to the other. We try to take this into account as much as we can. But things have become so tough that only those very excellent students are getting scholarships. So actually, this was the case 30 years ago.
But the system that you're applying right now, I don't want to be polemic, but I think this favors Brazilian applicants, and it drives them out of the country, but you need them here. I know of several cases, people moved on to Germany, Great Britain, but they couldn't get a postdoctoral fellowship here, and they're doing very well in foreign countries. And I mean, with human resources in highly educated levels, relatively low in Brazil, you know, it's
I know.
It's a big concern.
I quite agree that we are really worried about having brain drain. Yeah. But on the other hand, we cannot close the country. We need to bring people from other countries. So we need to find a balance there, and not to lose our best students. But on the other hand, we still need to attract a lot, because you see, internationalization of our science is really low, still very low. and we need it. And our way to do it is to bring good people from abroad. So that's one of the main reasons why you have this sort of format for the schools or the vice sides.
In the, just maybe can I ask another question related to this, because this relation between projects and funding is now less favorable. Does this affect the distribution within applied projects and basic science projects?
No. Not yet, no problem, no, it's not. What's now taking place is that those groups who have big projects are being favored, because there is evidence from at FAPESP that the impact of our science decreases in the following order. Highest impact is for the CPDs, for the big projects, then the thematic projects, then the ordinary projects. And therefore, we are trying to favor the big projects, those who have shown that they are producing high impact science.
Okay, thanks. Do you have a general profile of a student that win a master fellowship or a PhD fellowship? For example, the number of papers or...
Yeah. Okay. So I'll talk about physics. Other areas are different. So for the master students, the only important thing, or the most important thing, are the scores for an undergrad. If the person produces a paper during his undergrad course, he can count favorably, but the most important thing is the score. So now typically a student from UFSCar or USP, or Unicamp, or one of, let's say, the major institutions in physics, if the person has a score, an average score of 8 or 8-ish, he or she will get a grant for master. For the PhDs, we still consider the undergraduate scores plus the disciplines in graduate school. So A's, all A's is preferable. If the person has 1 or 2 B's, he or she will have to compensate with other things. And for the PhD, we don't really give a lot of emphasis on the scientific production because it varies a lot from group to group. We'll pay attention to that, and if someone has very nice productivity, but in fact, someone who has done a very good master MSc thesis with good publications, usually they have high scores as well, so not a big deal. For the postdocs, I would say that the guys getting postdocs now have typically, I would say, 5, 6 papers. Some have more, 10, 15. It depends a lot. And obviously, we do take into account whether the person is working in small groups, whether the person is the first author, so on and so forth. So we look into this thing. But typically, if the student of the postdoc applicant has produced, say, 5, 6 papers, 4 or 5 papers, it's, I mean, it's a good student with MSc and PhD having this number, or 3 papers if the papers are very good. So we don't count numbers, but obviously if someone finishes a PhD with just 1 paper, and unless the paper is very special, so the person is not going to be competitive because, But obviously, if the person finishes several papers in 1 year, then he or she can apply and get.
Well then, thank you so much. So much.
Most welcome.
Really clarifying. And you know that there are all these opportunities, and one of the objectives of this school is to show our infrastructure, our expertise, and also to show that there are opportunities, funding opportunities, and FAPESP is willing to analyze proposals from foreign students.
Sure.
Really willing.